Our final focus, the drug war being fought by the United States at the source of supply, South America. President Bush met today with the president of Bolivia, a major coca growing nation, and he promised, "You and your countrymen will not stand alone." The U.S. has backed a major coca eradication program there. Sitting between Bolivia and the major cocaine exporting nation of Colombia is the country of Peru, which supplies much of the raw product for the Colombian drug factories. The Bush administration has carried its war against cocaine directly to Peru, especially in the rugged area of the Huallaga Valley. We have a report from Sonia Russeler of Independent Television News.
It looks like the Vietnam War. The helicopters are Vietnam vintage, the pilots are Vietnam veterans. But this is the world's cocaine bowl, Peru's Upper Huallaga Valley. More than half the world's coca leaf, the raw material for cocaine, grows here. The rainforest is being chopped down. Every bright green field is a coca farm. It's the front line of America's war against drugs, in a valley controlled by the Maoist Sendero Luminoso, the shining path. Every raid is dangerous. The enemy, both the guerrillas and the drug militias, take cover inside the forest. At the center of this entire operation is the Santa Lucia base, a fort in the heart of guerrilla territory. The operation is directed by the American government, the State Department and the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, together with the Peruvian police force. Most of the foot soldiers are Peruvian. Most of the money comes from Washington, $26 million this year. To protect their lives, we've been asked to conceal the agents' identities.
It's in our interest to be here to help them out. It's better to work here at the source, where I would argue you get more bang for the bucks than to work in the States.
The day we arrived, the agents had just busted 2 laboratories. Shots were still being fired around the first, an ordinary hut. It was half an hour from the base. Coca refining has now become a cottage industry.
We were doing an eradication program over here on the other side of the fields, and some of the security people came in and were checking the security perimeter for security, and they ran into this house, which is basically a cocalero's house where people live and cultivate the coca in the area. You'll find filter racks for filtering the product of coca base and processing into coca paste, and also a drying table to refine the product and make it into a powder.
Eradication is still only done by hand. It's slow and dangerous. 34 workers have been killed. It's just restarted. This time the targets are seedlings to limit expansion. But a machete alone could never tackle the 100,000 acres that are already yielding coca. The problem with eradicating is that it pushes the growers into the arms of the guerrillas. In that sense, Peru's priority to fight terrorism conflicts with America's priority to fight drugs. The man in charge of Peru's anti-drug police argues the war against drugs can be won, but not by repression alone.
If we only repress, the coca grower has a choice. Either he goes somewhere else and grows more coca, or he probably joins the shining path.
The alternative to repression is the soft way to get rid of coca, to replace it with other crops. We travel to the isolated valley of La Convención to see how it works on the ground. This was one of the sacred valleys of the Inca Empire. Now it's a testbed for the United Nations project to encourage peasants to give up coca. The leaf of the plant has been used here for centuries.
We chew leaves at night when we're working, because it stops us from falling asleep.
For these people, coca is a sacred plant. It's chewed and drunk as a medicinal herb.
There, in the Huallaga, they do make cocaine, but here we use coca as medicine. If they take it away from the peasants, I don't know what will become of them.
Coca is more than an income here. It's a traditional part of their culture. That means replacing it isn't simply a question of money. All the roads into the valley were blockaded, and the peasants were threatening to tear up the tracks. It's an all-out strike. Hundreds of peasants gathered, demanding a higher price for coca and the removal of the UN program. They want their valley of Convención to be declared officially a coca-growing zone, a zona cocalera. It's still legal to grow coca here, as long as it's sold for the legitimate market, for tea or chewing. We asked them if they were selling it to the drug traffickers.
Es mentira eso. Eso es mentira, señorita, porque...
That's a lie, miss. That's a lie. We sell our coca to the government.
Nuestros hijos viven con ese coca comemos.
Our babies live on coca. Coca feeds us. Coca educates our children. Coca supports everything.
Total, estamos sufriendo, señorita, por eso no queremos...
We're suffering. That's why we don't want to give up our coca. What are we going to live off? Nothing else grows on the hills. They are too dry. Coffee can't grow. Absolutely nothing. That's why I grow coca.
After 6 days on strike, the peasants were holding out, surviving mainly on coca leaves. It dulls hunger and acts as a mild stimulant, like tea or coffee. For the peasants, the leaf is a source of vitamins. It prevents headaches, stops tooth decay, and helps them cope with living at over 10,000 feet. The steep hillsides are covered with coca. A plant can be harvested 3 times a year. This farm produces nearly 700 kilos of leaf a year. By selling the crop to the government, this family will make £400, a good living. If they were to sell it to the drug traffickers, they'd make more. They're not producing cocaine, yet they say they're suffering because cocaine isn't legal.
Ahora lo que usted me pregunta de la legalización de la cocaína.
Legalization of cocaine? I think it's a world issue. I ask you, cocaine isn't the only drug. There's alcohol, tobacco, cigarettes. How many die in the United States and in England from alcohol?
Legal coca is brought to the government's warehouse, 6 hours away by train. Inside, 265,000 kilos of coca leaf. With all this, you could make 85,000 kilos of cocaine. On the streets of New York or London, that's worth more than $2,100 million. This, though, is only used to make tea bags, and even those can't be exported. We drove further down the Convención Valley to find the peasants who had chosen to take the United Nations advice and give up growing coca. The roads were blockaded by the strikers. The UN's project is to encourage farmers to give up coca voluntarily and grow other crops, such as coffee, instead. The idea, which has strong international support, is that peasants must be given an alternative. Nothing, though, is as profitable.
It is difficult. I will make more with coca, but it is against the law.
Last year, international coffee prices collapsed, and the few who did switch from coca have been rewarded with poverty. Other possible alternative crops command even lower world prices. Darwin Berrio heads the government's regional development agency in the valley. He argues that substitution makes the poor give up their livelihood to protect the rich.
I hope that crop substitution works, but not at the expense of hunger, not at the expense of need, not at the expense of the poor of this valley. Let the rich countries who want their children to be healthy and not take drugs, let them devote some of their resources so that these people can have a better life.
Y prácticamente es una guerra.
It's a war.
we peasants would return to armed struggle. In the 60s, we fought for land or death. Now, we'll fight for coca or death.
Ahora gritamos, coca o muerte, venceremos.
In the Huallaga, 300 miles away, it's already a war. Coca hasn't been grown traditionally here. It's been brought in by market forces, the cocaine business. A soft approach, encouraging other crops, could never compete with the prices the drug barons pay. This field, known as Tango 3, is the test site for a chemical herbicide, Spike. A year ago, this was a thriving coca field. 3 weeks after spraying, all the coca plants died, leaving only twigs. And after this test, the Americans feel mass spraying of Spike over the valley is the only solution.
We've discovered a chemical which is safe to use and which is devastatingly effective against coca. With herbicide eradication early applied, you can do it on such a scale that it won't be dribble, 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 and you won't have that effect of a guy saying, I'm going to move down the road because they got me here.
4 planes spraying Spike could wipe out most of the coca in 6 months. The threat of chemical spraying has outraged environmentalists. The people who sprayed Agent Orange across Vietnam, they say, are now ready to bring you Spike. The Americans argue back, saying hidden coca laboratories use even more damaging chemicals. Either way, the rainforest is doomed to become grassland or coca fields. The war against coca can only be won if the men and women who grow it can find a profitable alternative. In the meantime, only a massive operation of chemical spraying can kill cocaine at source. The question is whether any country in Latin America is prepared to pay the price.
Next tonight, the stranglehold drugs and guerrillas have on Peru. Fatal bombings and a 2-day general strike called by Maoist Shining Path guerrillas have brought a reign of terror to the country. And the hardline government of Alberto Fujimori can't seem to stop them. The rebels feed off Peru's vast illicit drug trade. It's estimated the country produces 2/3 of the world's supply of cocaine. Much of the raw cocoa is grown in the Huallaga Valley. Correspondent Elizabeth Farnsworth visited the area and filed this report.
East of the high peaks of the Andes lies the Huallaga River Valley, a vast, sparsely populated area 5 times larger than the country of El Salvador. The Huallaga's great expanse of green is broken by small villages like Chinao or Lamas that look peaceful and lovely in the afternoon sunshine. But just beyond are the bushes that provide the leaf for 2/3 of the world's crack and cocaine. In recent years, this valley has become a war zone where drug traffickers, the military, the police, and 2 leftist guerrilla groups fight for power. 10,000 people have died here since the mid-1980s. The Maoist Shining Path, Peru's largest, most ruthless guerrilla organization, controls much of the southern part of the valley. It even dominates the area around the U.S.-funded Santa Lucia base, which houses a unit of special counter-narcotics police and about 30 advisors from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. A second guerrilla group, the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, or MRTA, is fighting for control of the northern half of the valley, around the city of Tarapoto. A local cameraman filmed this confrontation between guerrillas and the army along a key stretch of highway outside Tarapoto. The MRTA was showing its strength and harassing the military. After a few hours of combat, soldiers moved in, and the guerrillas faded back into the hills. As we arrived in Tarapoto, soldiers were patrolling the streets because the guerrillas had called a general strike. They were threatening to kill anyone who defied them. A few shops closed, but most vendors refused to be intimidated. This man was about to open his stall in the central market.
We can't go along with something that's called by armed guerrillas. We don't agree with them. We're always looking for peace and a way for our families to survive.
Survival is tough in Tarapoto. People here are often caught between the military, the guerrillas, and the drug traffickers.
Every day the violence grows. We are living in a very insecure situation. It seems untrue, a lie. There is no security. There is no tranquility.
Mario Gonzalez came to the Huallaga as a school teacher 18 years ago. He has watched the valley change as coca became the main crop. One of his schools was in Lamas, a village just outside Tarapoto.
5 years ago, I worked here in Lamas as director of a teacher's college. It was the first institute of higher education in this village. I was founder and director, and in that period, Lamas was one of the most tranquil villages in the state, but then the indiscriminate planting of coca began and the first guerrilla groups arrived. Behind these little hills, there used to be corn, there used to be beans, corn, beans, and pineapple. Now it's all coca. Everyone knows it, but it's not against the law to plant coca in Peru, so they just leave it alone. And today, we have a Lamas abandoned by the forces of the state and won over by subversion. The tranquility is only on the surface.
Lamas is a key stronghold of the MRTA, and as we walked through the village, Mario lamented the fact that many of his best students have become either guerrillas or coca farmers.
The young will join the MRTA because they have nowhere to work. There are no jobs. There are no agricultural credits for alternate crops. One alternative is to be a teacher, but in the countryside a teacher makes very little money, so even teachers are planting coca, with the help of their students' fathers.
En route to other villages where Mario had taught school, our car was the only vehicle on the road. Because of the strike, travelers stayed home to avoid the wrath of the guerrillas. We had planned to hike into the coca fields, but with the army and the guerrillas out in force, it was impossible. We found coca farmers in their villages, also trying to avoid trouble. In Shanao, a coca farmer told us he would prefer to grow corn, but there is no market, and the price is too low. Price supports for alternate crops would be one solution, Mario said, but the government of President Alberto Fujimori, in its embrace of the free market, has dropped price supports for corn and other crops. This video shot for Peruvian television shows how farmers grow the coca leaf and process it into paste, using their feet to mix the leaves with kerosene and other chemicals. Traffickers ship the paste from clandestine landing strips to Colombia for processing into crack or cocaine. When President Alberto Fujimori suspended the Constitution and disbanded Congress on April 5th, he argued that the extreme measures were necessary to combat the drug traffickers and guerrillas. But so far, not much has changed in the Huallaga. Peruvian police and their U.S. advisors from the DEA continue to dynamite landing strips and to burn remote laboratories. But within days of uprooting plants, destroying a landing strip, or burning a lab, new ones appear deeper in the jungle.
The acts of war, the destruction of the plants, the attempts to eliminate the bands of drug traffickers and the guerrillas have failed to produce any results. After 5 or 6 years of applying this policy, the cultivation of coca has increased, not decreased.
General Eduardo Bellido commands all the forces which are fighting the drug and guerrilla wars in the Huallaga. He said the Shining Path and the MRTA are formidable enemies because they get millions of dollars a year from the drug traffic.
For each flight of coca paste from here, they get between $12,000 and $15,000. And this finances their food and pays them an average of $400 to $500 a month, as if they were mercenaries of the revolution. A functionary with many years of working for the state doesn't earn that much. A mercenary of the guerrillas earns much more than a general of the army, as in my case.
Gana mucho más que un general del ejército, como en mi caso. Sus remuneraciones son superiores.
The guerrillas have better pay, better equipment, good radios, and they can buy good arms.
Peruvian conscripts, on the other hand, are poorly paid and equipped. And for the entire Huallaga, the military has fewer than 10 helicopters. General Bellido admitted that the lack of resources leaves the military and police open to corruption. But even with all the difficulties, he said he was having some success. He let us speak with a Shining Path guerrilla who had given herself up and was providing useful intelligence to the army. She was nervous and insisted on wearing a mask for the interview. In private, she told us she was not being mistreated. She is only 15 years old.
I joined up and I spent 5 months with the Shining Path. After 2 months, they gave me the rank of Militar de Compañía, company military commander. 30 men were under me. A company is led by 3 commanders, military, political, and logistical. I had children from 7 years up under my command. They were combatants. They're the children of people organized by the party, and they have to join the guerrilla army. They can't rebel. They can't flee to an army base and tell all, because of their families. If the children tell anything, their families suffer.
Both sides in this war caused their share of suffering. The army is accused of taking prisoners and then making them disappear. As we left the base, our car was surrounded by people whose relatives had been taken from their homes at night by the army.
We're in a state of emergency here, and there are no innocents. It's lucky we found you. You need to know what's happening. My brother isn't guilty. So why are they keeping him at the base so long? We can't say anything. We know prisoners are treated badly. Everyone knows it. But we can't scream to the world. The army is coming.
If the army refuses to release its prisoners, their families can turn for help to a peace commission organized by the local Catholic Church. Psychologist Humberto Rodriguez works with the commission.
There is a loss of rationality here because of the war. Fantasies grow tremendously. We begin to be afraid of our own shadows. And there is a silence in the face of all this. People prefer to remain silent, thinking it will save their lives. Our office helps people break their silence. For example, our lawyer responds to the desperate cries of families of people who have been detained or have disappeared.
The leaders of the Catholic Commission are convinced there can be no peace in the Huallaga until other crops replace coca.
We could produce alternative crops. The Catholic Church has an organization, an itinerant missionary team that's working now with support from other countries to help farmers develop alternative products.
Ayudando a los campesinos en la producción de productos alternativos.
But if there is no policy of support for this work from the government, from international organizations, and from other countries, we can't escape this crisis that's suffocating our country.
There are only a few isolated programs in the Huallaga promoting alternate crops. Most of the Peruvian government's meager resources and almost all U.S. counter-narcotics aid have gone to the police and the military. Meanwhile, coca production continues to spread.
Estamos precisamente en el lugar donde es el futuro
We're precisely in the place that's the future of coca. Because of the repression of the army as well as the guerrillas, all the people in the upper Huallaga have come to plant coca here. And from here, the great valley of Chanusi begins, an unexplored virgin valley where there are thousands of acres newly planted in coca.
As we left the Huallaga, the general strike was over, and trucks traveled the highway again. We stopped above San Miguel de Rio Mayo, a village where 400 people, half the population, had been arrested during the strike. The army was looking for guerrilla leaders. Most of the 400 were released, and now children played peacefully on the riverbank. But there's a saying here that the river is hungry. It's a death threat used by traffickers and guerrillas, and children like these often stop during their play to watch as the victims of the violence float by.
Next tonight, what can and should the United States do to help promote democracy in a South American country fighting a three-front war on poverty, drugs, and Maoist guerrillas? The country is Peru, the third largest in South America and also among its poorest. Nearly half of its 22 million people live in extreme poverty. Peru's biggest export is coca leaves, which neighboring countries process into cocaine for sale in the United States and Europe. Meanwhile, a guerrilla movement has been fighting Peruvian governments for years in conflicts that have cost 25,000 dead. 10 days ago, Peru's elected president, Alberto Fujimori, called for an offensive against the guerrillas and the drug dealers. He declared a state of emergency and suspended the constitution. We begin our coverage with a background report.
Fujimori, a university president of Japanese descent, surprised most people when he won Peru's presidential election 2 years ago. He came to office promising market-based economic reforms to lift the country from poverty and aggressive programs against drug traffickers and against the guerrillas. The guerrilla movement, called the Shining Path or Sendero Luminoso, has been among the most durable and vicious in South America. In the past few years, it has spread from the countryside into Lima and other cities, promising economic justice and carrying out bombings and assassinations, like this car bombing in February at the U.S. ambassador's residence. The guerrillas are especially strong in the Huallaga Valley, where much of Peru's coca leaves are grown. With U.S. aid, with a drug enforcement agency task force, and with a special forces training mission, Peruvian forces have been trying to suppress drug trafficking. But President Fujimori, at the recent drug summit in San Antonio, Texas, said suppression alone would not work, and he called for more money to pay for crop substitution, to give Peru's farmers an economic incentive to give up their biggest money-earning crop. In an interview in San Antonio with NewsHour correspondent Charles Krause, Fujimori spoke directly of his differences with the United States on drug policy.
Do you think the United States is in fact committed to this idea of yours that crop substitution can decrease the coca crop much faster than eradication? I ask you because Assistant Secretary of State Bernard Aronson testified before Congress last week, and what he said is that crop substitution is a dangerous fantasy that simply will not work.
We have signed an agreement between Peru and the United States where we state very clear those objectives of substitution, one of the objectives. This position of dangerous fantasy, I consider as a dangerous position from the part of the United States to take with respect to this agreement. I am afraid that maybe the repression of thinking is coming back again when 10 years of experience has given us this complete failure.
A month after that interview, as the drug and economic and guerrilla problems kept pressing on the president, he declared the state of emergency. Many members of the Peruvian parliament protested, but several polls indicated that the city populations were supporting the Fujimori measures. In any event, within days of the coup, the guerrillas showed they would not be cowed, launching new attacks in urban areas. In Washington, the Organization of American States met to consider measures to protest the suspension of Peruvian democracy. The United States has suspended nearly $300 million in economic aid, and yesterday it withdrew Green Beret military advisors. Secretary of State James Baker expressed sympathy with Fujimori's problems, but not with his methods.
There is no alternative. You cannot destroy democracy in order to save it.
The American nations at the OAS voted to deplore the coup, but not to take the stronger step of imposing economic sanctions, as they did after the coup in Haiti last year.
We get 4 views on the Peru story. Roberto McLean is Peru's ambassador to the United States. Ricardo Letts is a member of one of the opposition parties in the Peruvian parliament. He was outside the country when the president shut down parliament. Tina Rosenberg is an author who has spent several weeks with the Shining Path guerrillas, the only non-Peruvian to have done so. She is the author of Children of Cain, Violence and the Violent in Latin America. She is now a visiting fellow at the Overseas Development Council. And Mark Falkoff is a resident scholar specializing in Latin American policy issues at the American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Ambassador, the OAS and the United States are both saying your president made a mistake. Did he make a mistake?
Well, what has happened in Peru now is a tragedy. It's a big tragedy without any doubt. But my impression is that it is the least of the tragedies that could have happened.
What do you mean by that?
That the alternatives were perhaps even worse. Because what President Fujimori has been complaining is that in one hand, he has been assailed by the, not guerrillas, but the terrorist movement. I mean, the terrorists in the fight with the government and society has caused in 12 years about 25,000 deaths. The destruction of goods and properties by the Shining Path is of a value that would have been enough to pay the external debt of Peru. And when the peasants' rounds and the army in the countryside forced the terrorists to move into the cities, they are beginning to attack not precisely government officials, government properties, but grassroots organizations. They are murdering grassroots leaders. For instance, not long ago, one of the most popular root leaders of Peru, Maria Elena Moyano, was not only killed savagely, but also after being shot with 5 shots, her corpse was put with a dynamite and exploded. I mean, that is trying to really impose a reign of terror and to frighten people. That is one of the alternatives that could happen to Peru.
Mr. Letts, you hear what the ambassador is saying your country was facing. Does that justify what the president has done there?
Absolutely not. It doesn't justify it on the terrorist assail that he mentions, and not either on the economic crisis, which was, of course, another reason, and not either on corruption on government and military levels, and not, of course, because of what has been blamed Parliament doing obstruction in Peruvian politics. That is, of course, not true.
All right, you've thrown out 3 or 4 things there. Let's go back to the first point, though, that the ambassador mentioned. These terrorists killed 25,000 people, enormous values.
25,000 people were killed during this subversive war. Those people have been killed, of course, by Sendero and its terrorist methods, which we condemn absolutely. But they have been killed also by violation of human rights from the military. Peru is the country that during the past 5 years has been condemned by the United Nations Human Rights Committee in Geneva, because it's the country where the human rights violations is worst. And now the military will run Peru without any control from parliament or from the attorneys and the judiciary.
Mr. Ambassador, what about that?
Yes, it's true. There have been many human rights violations, and the government of President Fujimori...
By the military, by the...
Yes, I mean by the military and by the police, yes, and the government of President Fujimori is trying and has been trying for the past year to reduce it. According to United Nations figures, the number of disappearances, between commas, have been reduced to less than 50% in the last year than the previous year.
But you're saying the situation's bad, but it's gotten better.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, not so. It happened from August to September, October of the past year because the North American Congress was very firm on principles and on stopping military aid to Peru. But then again, when the end of the year came about, over 300 people in Peru had been disappeared after detention from security forces. So Peru still stands the worst country in the world where human rights are violated.
Let me ask you, Mr. Ambassador, why was it necessary to suspend democracy, to put legislators in jail, to suspend the court system in order to deal with the terrorists?
Well, I was trying to explain that. First, it was the terrorists, then it was the pressure of the danger of, due to the opposition in Congress, the economic program of the government could fail, and so as a result of that, the obstruction for the economic program, the danger of the drug traffic, the terrorists, it left the government with no other alternative than to do that. I don't think this is a happy thing. I don't think that this is something that one could defend. But, I mean, it is a tragedy. But nevertheless, if you study and analyze the alternatives, it is the least tragic of all. And what is important is that the actors of this drama, or this tragedy, the people of Peru, apparently from one reason coming from Peru, is supporting massively the
based on some public opinion polls that have been done.
Yes.
Well, Mr. Letts, what about that? There have been polls that show, particularly in the cities, that people are supporting the president's action.
Okay, the ambassador says it's a tragedy. It's not a happy thing. So let's ask ourselves, what is Mr. Fujimori laughing about when he's shown in the media as you have shown him a minute ago? Now, I think it is a big tragedy. It's nothing...
I don't know what you're referring to. Did we see him laughing at
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, you did. You could go back and show it again, and everybody would see it here in the United States. Now, the polls, the military is out, the armored cars are out, the bayonets are out. They have taken the streets, they have taken people into jail, they have intervened the media, they have taken journalists and lawyers into jail, arrested. And now, are those conditions to have polls? Are those conditions to take a public opinion? We have mentioned that Duvalier, Pinochet, Ferdinand Marcos, and Mussolini in his time, they all did have polls, and they all did have, for a moment, public opinion in their favor. Garcia, after the killings in the prisons in 1986,
this is your former president.
Yes, Garcia Perez. Had 95% of approval after killing around 300 prisoners of Sendero Luminoso in 1986. But he finished with 15% approval. If we are going to change governments or take military coups just because what the polls say, democracy is finished the world over.
Let's look specific. Let's take these 3 points. I want to deal first of all with the terrorists, with the shining path, and turn to you, Ms. Rosenberg, because you've written about them. Is this the growing threat, the beginning to be uncontrollable threat that President Fujimori has painted?
Sure. I agree completely with the diagnosis that the ambassador has given on the threat of the terror of the shining path. The question, however, is how do you best defeat the shining path? There's only 2 places in Peru where the shining path was being beaten. And in both places, the reason was that they were places that were characterized by more democracy. There were fewer human rights violations on the part of the military, and peasants could organize, people could organize soup kitchens. Ordinary Peruvians could get what they wanted under the current system, and therefore they rejected the Shining Path. The problem with the coup is that's going to shut down now, and they're going to go back to a strategy of total militarization and indiscriminate repression, which has failed.
Their attacks, in fact, have stepped up in the 10 days or so since this took place. What about that, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, I agree that with Mr. Letts that public opinion is not enough. Of course it's not enough. Public opinion is indispensable, but it's not enough. The other thing is the respect for human rights. The foreign minister of Peru the other day in the OAS invited the Secretary General of the OAS, the president of the conference, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights to go to Peru and to prove that what he said, that at this moment there are no detainees and no civil liberties are restored except the parliament. I mean, they can see that.
Yeah, and I understand you wanted to respond to his point, but what about moving on to Ms. Rosenberg's point that if anything, this is going to make the Shining Path more militant? Their attacks have stepped up since the coup has taken place.
I have read Ms. Rosenberg's book, and I agree entirely with her, of course. But I mean, the whole purpose of this, the third thing I was going to say is that these measures are temporary, and the purpose of these, the declared purpose, is to look for more democracy. I subscribe every word of what Ms. Rosenberg has said in her book. I entirely agree with her.
When you say temporary, how temporary?
He has the first is, I think the last is 6 months
before there'll be a plebiscite of voting.
Yes.
Mr. Falcoff, where do you come down on whether President Fujimori has done the right thing or not?
Well, I don't agree that he has done the right thing. When a country is at war, as Peru is and has been, you have to have the maximum amount of moral legitimacy in the world community, and that's particularly true for a country like Peru, which has needed international assistance of the most basic humanitarian variety, leave aside military assistance, DEA, etc., for a number of years. You cannot disarm yourself, as Fujimori has done, and expect to win a great moral victory. Even if in 6 months he is able to win his plebiscite, even if, which is a big if, he still has the problem of what I would call the institutional itinerary. All right, you've won your plebiscite. What next? How do you march back? Do you just call people like Mr. Letts back to session? I mean, he's broken with the fragile institutional framework of Peru, and now he's out there all by himself alone, and he'd better succeed. But even if he wins that plebiscite, he's still out there on a limb.
What does the president have to do, Mr. Ambassador, or anyone else, in the next 6 months or so to make this successful? I mean, how far does he have to get to defeat the Shining Path, to bring the economy back on course, to defeat the drug trafficking and so forth?
I don't think that can be done in 6 months. I mean, but I think that what he has to do now is to democratize and to make more flexible and expeditious, and to allow public opinion to be reflected in Congress, in the judiciary, in the Tribunal of Constitutional Guarantees.
But Parliament's been suspended. How do you do that?
Well, no, I mean, because he has declared that he's going to call for new parliamentary elections.
So you're saying that when the next Parliament comes along, Mr. Letts, is that possible? I mean, could that work?
Has anybody of us ever seen in history a dictator that then, after he's taken power, close Parliament and every other organ of control in the next 3 months or 6 months or 4 weeks or 6 weeks, hands it out again? Has anybody ever in history seen this? Isn't it always that after he takes power? Fujimori is a Peruvian gentleman who said before publicly, Peru needs an emperor. He needs a 10-year emperor at least. I'm not proposing myself, but I'm stating the idea. He said that in a speech a few months ago.
Mr. Falco?
Well, what's not being said in Peru right out loud, and it certainly hasn't been reported in the United States, but there is in Peru a dangerous tendency to look south to Chile, to the Pinochet experiment. Sure. And for years I've heard people saying in Peru, we need another Pinochet.
When you say people, which people are you
well,
talking
business
about?
people, educated people of some affluence, but also cab drivers and shopkeepers. There's a frustration with the system, and in societies of this type, there's always a potential for a certain authoritarian streak in the culture. But the problem is that Chile isn't Peru, and Peru isn't Chile, and let's not forget that what happened in Chile happened at an enormous human cost, and an enormous moral cost, which that country is still sorting out. But even so, I don't see Mr. Fujimori as replicating the the Chilean experiment.
Ms. Rosenberg.
One of the dangers of this coup is that the people behind it, Mr. Fujimori is being controlled by certain military and ex-military officers, and the two most important people behind the coup, one of them was a lawyer for many years for drug traffickers, and the other one is a man who, with a serious record of human rights violations, he was in charge of a zone where a very notorious massacre was committed. These are not people with a commitment to human rights. They are not people with a commitment to ending drug trafficking, and even though those are serious problems, this coup is not going to do anything to help solve them.
And you're saying they are controlling what he is doing? Is
yes,
that what you're saying?
I am saying that.
Mr. Ambassador?
Well, my impression is it is not. However, I think that the important thing, I'm sorry, for public opinion is to keep a watch, because indeed there is a danger that when the Congress disappears, then there is no control. I mean, then public opinion, both at home and abroad, have the duty to control and survey that no human rights violations are committed, and that no excesses are committed, and that the speed to go back to constitutional government is as quickly as possible.
How can you keep watch? There's no judicial system anymore. You can't file a habeas corpus petition. Where are people going to report these things to? I mean, all the institutional mechanisms to control the government and the military have been removed.
Where was the military in terms of fighting the drug war? There were so many allegations that were out there about the military supporting, or at least certainly not fighting, the drug trafficking that Fujimori's administration was going after. Mr. Lev?
When Fujimori's the most important advisor on drug trafficking resigned in last January, Mr. Hernando de Soto, who is well known in this country, he accused the government, Mr. Fujimori and the military, of being responsible for running the 5 airports that legally receive and let go small planes from Colombia that take and bring money and take drugs. And everybody knows about that. The military are involved. And if corruption is now the thing we are discussing about, around Fujimori's own family there was a big public issue on corruption. So, what I would like to say, please, is what is Mr. Ambassador doing representing that government? He is in total agreement with the lady that has said more democracy is what we need. He is in total agreement with what I have said as far as human rights is concerned. So why is he representing that government?
I can answer this, because what are the alternatives? I mean, we are talking about evils. Yes, evils do exist. But let me tell you something which is very important. First, we are talking about a trespassing on the law, and this is a very serious matter. But I mean, no one has said...
Trespassing on which law?
I'm sorry, breaking the law, I mean that the constitutional order has been broken.
Yes.
I mean, by these tragic events. But on the other hand, what has happened is that we live in a country, in Peru, in which at least half of the population, and I don't mean the drug traffickers, are outside and against the law. I mean, for instance, 1/3 at least of the gross national product is produced by people who don't obey the legal codes, the industrial code. They produce outside and against the law.
You mean the farmers and others who are involved in the Coca?
No, not the Coca. I mean industry. I mean what people call the informal movement in Peru. About 40% of the housing in Lima is built against the laws, and 60% of the transport. So we are talking of a country in which the social prestige of law is very low. So, I mean, the answer is, what is the alternative? I am not happy with the situation as it is, I mean, but is there any other valid alternative in this moment?
Mr. Falco, what about that?
Well, I think that you don't establish the rule of law at the lowest levels of a society by breaking it at the highest levels of a society. We have to start somewhere. And I think that the government has put itself, what worries me is that the Peruvian government has put itself in a position where it's very difficult to backpedal now. What institutionality is it going to go back to?
But that sounds fine, but in reality, wasn't this a president who would move pretty far down the road of creating a capitalist open market system, and certainly farther than...
Well, that would be a subject for another program.
Well,
I'm less impressed with that than some. But
there had been reforms, economic
there have been
reforms,
some macroeconomic structural reforms.
Facing enormous obstacles from the terrorists, from the Shining Path, the drug trafficking and so forth, backed into a corner. What else should this president have done?
Well, it seems to me that if in the framework of a democratic political community, you can't, I'm talking about the Congress, you can't sell a program of economic reform, then obviously the society is not ready for an economic reform, and that's all there is to it. It's not an inevitable thing. People have the right to fail democratically, if that's their right, but they have the right to make these choices.
And has the United States response been the correct one? Rosenberg?
I think I'd like to make one point about the economic program, which is that it's depended greatly on international loans, which are now going to be cut off. I think the economic gains that were made under Fujimori are now imperiled. I think the United States has responded strongly. That's very good. I think it should respond more strongly yet. It should advocate the cutting off of these loans with sanctions, because you have a very great danger in Latin America of this spreading. And I think the message needs to be clear that the solution is more democracy.
All right. Well, Ms. Rosenberg, Mr. Falkoff, Ambassador McLean, and Mr. Letts, we thank you all for being with us.
Thank you very much.